On behalf of the Dedman College Interdisciplinary Institute, I would like to welcome you to the keynote lecture for our Fall IMPACT Symposium on the Art of Compromise. I would like to express our gratitude to the Embry Family Foundation for their generous support of these symposia, which bring people from across a range of disciplines together to discuss issues of pressing concern. We launched this series last fall with a symposium focused on privacy, which it seems, with the revelations made by Eric Snowden, have become even more important than they seemed a year ago. Last spring, our symposium focused on big data and prediction. And this fall, in the midst of a government shutdown, or after, I guess I wrote this right before we reopened, right after the end of a government shutdown and a near escalation to war with Syria, our choice of topic again seems to be extremely timely. I would also like to thank and acknowledge Bill Tsutsui, the Dean of Dedman College. Dean Tsutsui has been instrumental to the launching of the Interdisciplinary Institute, and we are grateful for his continuing support. I want to remind everyone that we will be continuing our engagement with this topic of compromise tomorrow afternoon with a panel discussion among faculty members in history, political science, psychology, and mediation. This panel will be moderated by Chris Boyd, whose show Think airs on KERA, our local PBS station. This panel will begin at 3 p.m. in the East Ballroom of Hughes Trigg Student Center, which is in the basement of that building. For those of you coming from off campus, parking will be available at several places on campus, but you will need a permit. If you don't already have this permit, please see us after the lecture. And you can also find more information at our website, which is www.smu.edu/Dedman/DCII. Finally, I want to remind everyone to complete an evaluation form after the lecture. You can hand this in at the registration desk. There's some right around the back there if you didn't pick it up. What is compromise? Most dictionaries define it by stating that compromise involves a settlement of differences by mutual concessions. It involves some process of adjustment in conflicting or opposing claims or principles by reciprocal modifications of demands. While some think that compromise is a good thing, it clearly has extensive negative connotations that invoke ideas of capitulation or surrender of principles or objectives in the process of negotiation. Some have suggested that compromise is often an agreement that no party is happy with. In the political context, compromise is often linked with appeasement. Of this, we have many examples in history, and it is these historical examples that we began to think about as we focused on this topic. Writing in the New York Times on July 10, 2013, on the cost of compromise, Linda Greenhouse referenced observations made by retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens regarding Brown versus the Board of Education in his memoir, Five Chiefs. Justice Earl Warren extracted unanimity from his wary colleagues, Justice Stevens observes, but the price of that unanimity may have been too high. The court's compromise ordered to desegregate, quote, with all deliberate speed, rather than immediately, became a recipe for hardly any speed at all. A dissenting opinion here or in the follow-up Brown, too, may have been more effective in sending a clear message about the imperatives or the imperativeness of desegregation. But such compromises have deeper roots in our history, and it is to learn more of these that we have invited Professor Paul Finkelman to SMU as the keynote speaker for our symposium. Paul Finkelman is the President William McKinley Distinguished Professor of Law and Public Policy at Albany Law School. He's a specialist in American legal history, race relations, and the law, and the First Amendment. Professor Finkelman received his bachelor's degree from Syracuse University in American Studies and his MA and PhD degrees in history from the University of Chicago. In 2012, he was the John Hope Franklin Visiting Professor of American Legal History at the Duke Law School, and he has also held chairs at the University of Tulsa College of Law, the University of Akron School of Law, Cleveland State University Law School, and the University of Miami. He's the author of close to 200 scholarly articles and the author or editor of more than 35 books. Among these books, and the most recent of them, are Congress and the Crisis of the 1850s, Millard Fillmore, In the Shadow of Freedom, The Politics of Slavery in the National Capital, A March of Liberty, A Constitutional History of the United States, and the Dred Scott Case, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives on Race and the Law. As an expert not only in the law of slavery and constitutional law, but also in legal issues surrounding baseball, Professor Finkelman was the chief expert witness in the Alabama Ten Commandments monument case and in the lawsuit over who owned Barry Bonds' 73rd home run ball. His articles on religious monuments in public spaces and on the origins of the Second Amendment have been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court, while his work on those subjects, as well as slavery, race relations, property law, civil liberties, and affirmative action, have been cited by numerous state and federal courts. Professor Finkelman was clearly an obvious choice to give us an historical perspective on matters surrounding compromise. Tonight he will speak precisely to those issues in a lecture titled Compromise or Appeasement, Pro-Slavery Political Triumphs, 1787 to 1861. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Finkelman.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. It's been probably 30 years, I hate to admit it, since I spoke last at SMU, and I have a number of friends on the faculty who keep coming up to me, reminding me that we once were young. I still think we are. We just are a little older. But it really is wonderful to be here, and I want to thank the college and the foundation for supporting this lecture and this conference on compromise. Compromise, of course, has been in the air for the past few weeks as we have watched a crisis emerge or a crisis be manufactured in Washington, D.C. And I have listened to the pundits talking about how the end of the world is near and we might default on our debts. And then, of course, ultimately it fizzled away. Watching the crisis in Washington from a distance, I was reminded of various other historical moments and other compromises. And I also thought that the place of some of the players in this last crisis would fit perfectly well in other moments of American history, so that we can imagine I guess it's the junior senator from Texas, eloquently joining Patrick Henry in opposing the ratification of the Constitution on the grounds that, in Henry's case, the state of Virginia would have to give up too much. I could imagine the junior senator from Texas joined by the very also junior senator from Kentucky ranting about the election of another Kentuckian to the presidency in 1860 and the necessity of leaving the United States because, after all, the very world was shaken by the reality that someone who opposed slavery in a real way might actually be president of the United States. In between, of course, one would imagine, and this is a little harder to imagine because of his name and I presume his ethnicity and religion, Senator Cruz being a leading member of the Know Nothing Party in the 1850s, a party which stood for opposition to immigration and particularly to Catholic immigration, a party in whose platform there was a plank which said that Roman Catholics should never hold public office in the United States. And the Know Nothing Party, in a way, is very much, I think, like the Tea Party of today. It appeared on the scene out of nowhere. It made statements that made no sense to normal people. It gathered a certain amount of steam for a little while, ran a presidential candidate in 1856, Millard Fillmore, who had been an accidental president when Zachary Taylor died in 1850, served out the last 2.5 years of Taylor's term, then was not nominated by his own party and ran as a know-nothing in 1856. And Fillmore, of course, carried one state, Maryland, ironically a state which began as a colony of safe haven for British Catholics. And so it was Maryland that voted for the man who opposed Catholic office holding and really opposed foreign immigration in general. My prediction as a historian, and it's always dangerous to predict things as a historian, we have enough trouble predicting what happened without predicting what will happen. But my prediction is that when we think about compromise and we think about the Tea Party, in 4 or 5 years, if somebody mentions the Tea Party, we will respond by saying Darjeeling or Oolong, rather than thinking of Rand Paul or Ted Cruz, because the Tea Party will have faded away, crawled back under the rocks from which it came, and disappear, just as the Know-Nothings did, because one of the things that's clear about the history of the United States is that those political entities which refuse to compromise about anything, because everything is a matter of religious belief and deep felt ethical issues, no matter what it is, whether it's raising postage from 42 cents to 43 cents becomes a matter of the highest priority for which you might shut down the government, that those kinds of political entities cannot survive in the end, because in a complex democratic society, there has to be various kinds of compromises all the time. And one of the things that one had to understand when watching this last crisis was to think about what real crises might look like if there were people who represent the Tea Party around. If you're going to close down the government over health care, over making sure that all people can go to the doctor, what would you possibly do over segregation or slavery? All George Wallace wanted to do, after all, was close down the University of Alabama, or at least stand in the doorway and not let some people in. But the idea that you would shut down a government on political ideology would, I think, be strikingly odd even to people like Patrick Henry, who did not want the Constitution to be ratified because he feared a strong central government. It is also, of course, worth remembering, I was in Rand Paul's home state last week speaking, so I get to go from one bastion of Tea Party central to another. I carry little cubes of sugar with me so I can come to the Tea Party. And I was speaking on the way we treat veterans. I was invited by a group that supports wounded warriors. And I pointed out that for 17 days, no veterans of Afghanistan or Iraq were able to apply for veterans benefits because the VA was shut down. The hospitals remained open, of course, but the VA itself was shut down. And I wondered what constitutes patriotism among the people of Texas, or among the people of Tennessee, or Kentucky, or Alabama, where Tea Party people came from. What constitutes patriotism here in the Lone Star State that you would want to prevent veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq from being able to apply for their benefits because you don't like a particular law that was passed by both houses of Congress, signed by the president, and that president was then reelected for public office, essentially running on a platform that said, this is the law that I got passed. And so one has to wonder where patriotism and sanity intersect in the art of compromise. Now, what I want to do, having talked about this, because I felt I should, I hadn't planned on this is all off the cuff. And of course, all reminds me, and here I get to do one more thing which will set those of you, if you are in fact fans of the Tea Party, you can hate me even more now. Because, of course, all of this makes one think of the great philosopher and thinker of the 19th century, perhaps the most influential thinker of the 19th century, Karl Marx, who reminded people that history repeats itself. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. And what I would like to do now is talk about the tragedies, the tragedy of slavery, the tragedy that leads to a civil war, because I have just for the last few minutes, I hope, talked about the farce of history repeating itself. We, of course, think about compromise as something central to American society. And compromise is something that we learn about in the public schools, although I was just talking to somebody about the emerging changes of how one is taught history in Texas. By the way, I should add, I have lived in Texas. My wife is a Texan. I have voted in Texas. So I'm not coming here solely as a total outsider, although I realize that having not been born in Texas, I could never have been a Texan, no matter how long I actually lived here. but I do have relatives who were born here by marriage. I'm not sure what that means. I guess that makes me an in-law of Texas, right? But one of the things, of course, we learn in junior high or high school, we study the writing of the Constitution, and we learn something about the Great Compromise at the Constitutional Convention. And then we later learn about the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise. Then we learn about the Compromise of 1850. And we study these things as great events in American history because they are great compromises. And then suddenly, 10 years after the Compromise of 1850, we suddenly have Fort Sumter. And one wonders, well, how effective are these compromises if they lead not to a smoothing out of state relations, not to a peaceful resolution of the problem, but ultimately lead to the slaughter of approximately 650,000 Americans? What kind of compromise is it? How great is the compromise if that is the outcome? So let me start with the Constitutional Convention and a series of compromises that take place there. And we'll start with the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise in all the textbooks is the decision to give the states 2 votes in the Senate and then have the House of Representatives apportioned by population. And this was done because tiny little Connecticut and minuscule New Jersey insisted that they had to have equal votes in the government with gigantic Pennsylvania and literally huge, overwhelmingly gigantic Virginia. And so what has the Great Compromise brought us? Well, I played with some numbers today. I'm not a statistical person. I'm not a quant, as the people in the economics world talk about it. But I am capable of doing simple arithmetic. And I discovered that there are approximately 152 million people living in the 8 largest states in the United States. That includes California, Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania. Those 152 million people have 16 senators representing them in the U.S. Senate. There are approximately 137 million people living in the remaining 42 states. They have 84 senators representing them. And so I would ask you, as you think about the nature of American politics, what is wrong with this picture? What is wrong with the fact that the trees of Wyoming and Montana, you can't really say the people of Wyoming and Montana because it's very hard to find them, but the trees of Wyoming and Montana and the giant pieces of ice of Alaska, taking those 3 states together, have 3 times as many U.S. senators as the 26 million people living in Texas. And you have to wonder, what do we have when we talk about a democracy? And that is the Great Compromise. It is a compromise that has left us with a political system in which we are ruled not by the votes of the people, but rather by the votes of the trees and the large amounts of snow and the empty plains and the empty places where no one lives, or almost no one lives, but where 2 senators are elected to serve this vast emptiness. And this leads us to wonder, what is the nature of American democracy? But it gets better. I feel like that ad on TV, you know. But wait, there's more. And what is the more? The more, of course, is the presidential election. Now, just for fun of it, how many of you voted for either Mitt Romney or Barack Obama in the last presidential election? How many of you know you didn't vote for either of those people? And who did you vote for? You voted for the presidential electors. Can you name them? Can anybody name the people? No, none of you know who you voted for. You voted for the presidential electors pledged to Mitt Romney or Barack Obama. And so what we have is this weird, crazy thing called the Electoral College. The Electoral College is the spooky creature we keep in the closet. And every 4 years we let it out on Halloween to start scaring us with a real possibility couldn't happen in my lifetime. That one candidate could get 1 million more votes than the other and not get elected president. Oh, wait a minute. It did happen in my lifetime. He's coming here this week, right? The creature of the Electoral College. Now, what does it say about a nation that tries to preach democracy to the world when, in fact, we are the only place in the world where the person who gets the most votes doesn't get elected? It's a very strange process. Now, why do we have the Electoral College? That is another issue and leads to another compromise. Because the other great compromise at the convention is the compromise over the House of Representatives. Because when the delegates meet in 1787, they want to create a Congress that will be representative of the people. And at the very first day of discussion, Edmund Randolph of Virginia proposes what is known as the Virginia Plan or the Randolph Plan, although most scholars concede that it actually should be called the Madison Plan, since he's the guy who really drafted it. And in proposing the Virginia Plan, Edmund Randolph of Virginia says that the representation in the Congress should be based on the whole population of the state. This would be something equivalent to representative democracy. And immediately, delegate from New York, Alexander Hamilton, who had grown up on the island of St. Nevis, which was a slave-majority island in the Caribbean, raised his hand and said, I'd like to amend that by saying, based on the whole free population of the state. And that led to a gigantic debate in which Southerners said, of course we should count slaves for purposes of representation because slaves are part of our country. They're part of our population. Now, it is worth knowing that 11 years earlier, in 1776, only a month after the Declaration of Independence had been signed, there had been a similar debate over how to allocate taxes for the revolutionary government that was fighting England. And each state was going to have to pay money to the national government to support George Washington's army. And one of the delegates said, well, the taxes should be based on the population. So each state would pay taxes according to its population. And immediately, the Southerners got up and said, well, you can't count the slaves because they're not part of the population, they're property. And there's this giant debate over whether you could count slaves in the Southern population for the purposes of paying taxes to support the revolution. And during this debate, one of the delegates from South Carolina, a man named Lynch, gets up and says, if we are going to debate whether they are our property or not, there is an end to this confederation. And then Mr. Lynch goes on to say that there would be no more propriety in counting the slaves of the South for taxation than it would be in counting the sheep of New Hampshire. To which Ben Franklin, never afraid of a fight, never to be out-blustered by somebody or outwitted certainly by Thomas Lynch, Ben Franklin got up and said, well, there's a difference between slaves and sheep. Sheep will never make a revolution. And the point, of course, was that slaves were not only people, but they were a dangerous population within the society. In that debate, the South won. In other words, the northern states, all of which had some slaves, but not as many as South Carolina or Virginia, in that debate, the compromise, if you can call it a compromise, was that you would not count slaves for purposes of how you allocate revenue for the new revolutionary government. Now fast forward 11 years later, and suddenly the South Carolina delegation is saying, well, we must count slaves for purposes of representation because they're part of the population. And so this begins the debate over what is ultimately the 3/5 clause. And the 3/5 clause is sometimes called the 3/5 compromise. It's a compromise because the South wanted to count slaves at 5/5, and the northern states said you shouldn't count slaves at all for purposes of representation. And in the end, they vote to count them on a 3/5 ratio. By the way, this is not a statement about race, because free blacks would be counted fully for purposes of representation. And one of the ironies of American history is that in 1866, when the United States contemplated allowing the 11 former treasonous entities which had just made war on the United States government and attacked their own government, when they were contemplating whether those entities should be brought back in as states with representation in Congress, they of course discovered that they would have more representation in Congress than they did before the Civil War, because now all their slaves were free people and would be counted as whole persons for purposes of representation. So one of the ironies of the Civil War is that South Carolina, which began the war, got more representation in Congress after the war than it had before the war. But at the Constitutional Convention, what happens is that slave states are given representation based on their slaves. The next significant debate is about the presidency. And James Madison, the father of the Constitution, gets up and says, the fittest thing, the best thing, the most proper thing would be for the people to elect the president. And then he said, but there are a couple of problems with that. And the biggest one, Madison says, and I quote from Madison, Madison says, our Negroes won't count. And what does he mean by our Negroes won't count? Is that if we elect the president by popular vote, we're not going to be able to count the votes of slaves because obviously slaves can't vote. One of the other delegates in his own, he's taking notes, he puts a little asterisk and he says what Madison meant by this is that if we can't count the votes of slaves for the president, then people like Madison can't get elected president. And so what Madison does is to come up with the Electoral College. And how does the Electoral College work? Each state gets electors based on their 2 senators, which, by the way, even more significantly empowers states with almost no one living in them. Because in the presidential election, they get this bonus of the 2 senators, plus the number of representatives. And how are the numbers of representatives determined? By counting all of the free people and 3/5 of all the other people. So the result is, when the president is elected by counting slaves, even though, of course, we know slaves can't vote. So what it means is the vote of a Virginian or the vote of a South Carolinian was more powerful than a vote of someone from Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, where slavery didn't exist anymore, because they got electors even though they had many fewer voters. So these are the compromises the United States is setting up. And you have to ask, what is the compromise? What are the non-slave states or the emerging non-slave states, what are they getting in return for these compromises? Well, the final compromise debate is over commerce. The New England states would like Congress to be able to regulate commerce on a simple majority vote. And some of the Deep South states say, we don't want Congress to regulate commerce at all. We don't want regulations of international commerce, but we're willing to settle for it on a 2/3 vote in Congress. And the compromise that gets worked out is this. Commerce can be regulated on a simple majority, but there is a clause in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1, which says the migration or importation of such persons as the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited before the year 1808. In other words, the African slave trade is protected from any congressional interference until 1808. This is the only form of commerce that has a special protective clause. Now again, we read in the textbooks, and I have seen college textbooks in political science, in history, in law school, saying that the slave trade clause said that the slave trade must end in 1808, but the clause doesn't say it must end in 1808. It only says it can't end before 1808. Combining the 3/5 clause with the slave trade clause, one delegate said at the Constitutional Convention, when fairly explained, it comes to this. The inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connection and damns them to the most cruel bondages, he shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. In other words, if the 3/5 clause increases South Carolina's representation in Congress, then South Carolinians have an extra bonus for going to Africa and bringing new people back as slaves because it increases their political power even as it increases their economic power. Does this matter? Well, in 1800, we have a presidential election between a man who never owned a slave and believed slavery was morally wrong, and a man who at that time owned about 175 slaves. He would have owned closer to 300 slaves, but in the previous decade he'd sold close to 100 to pay for his constant importation of art and furniture and wine from France. Now, I happen to agree with his taste in wine, but it strikes me that it wouldn't have tasted quite so good knowing that some husband was sold away from his wife to pay for this case of wine. And of course, that is the election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson beats Adams by 6 electoral votes. If we take from Jefferson's total all of the electors created by counting slaves under the 3/5 clause, we do the same for Adams. Adams wins the election. Would it have mattered if a non-slaveholder had been president in 1803 when we acquired Louisiana, when we acquired this vast stretch of land, which would later, of course, be the scene of great divisive debates in the 1830s and 40s and 50s? I think it would have mattered a great deal. But the Electoral College and the 3/5 clause conspired to do something else. So let me turn then to the compromise that followed the acquisition of Louisiana. Because, of course, the first state to come in from the Louisiana Territory is, of course, Louisiana itself. And it comes in as a slave state, and nobody questions this. There are a huge number of slaves in Louisiana. There had been since the French arrived. There were more when the Spanish took over, and there were still more when finally the United States took over. The next state out of Louisiana is Missouri. Now, Missouri is way, way to the north of the rest of the South. And in fact, if you look at a map of the United States, Missouri sticks out kind of like this finger would be Kentucky, and here's Missouri up here, piercing into the north. Missouri is mostly north of the end of the Ohio River, and Congress had long passed an ordinance saying that the territory north of the Ohio River ought to be free territory. So Northerners argued Missouri should come in as a free state, not as a slave state, because it's really in the north, and that it was time to stop the spread of slavery. This was not a move to end slavery. This was not going to take anybody's property away from them. Southerners could still own human beings. They could still buy and sell human beings. Southern men could still have sex with black women slaves whenever they wanted, and no one would say anything. People could take their anger out, their frustrations, by beating the nearest slave. If people needed money, they could take a 5-year-old child and sell the child away from the mother, or they could take the mother and sell the mother away from the child. When a master died, you could auction off families apart, different people buying them. To give you an idea, when Thomas Jefferson died, he put in his will that his blacksmith would be able to stay at Monticello, live in the house that he lived in Monticello, keep all his blacksmith tools, live for free at Monticello and be free, and that he could live there with his family. The only thing that Master Tom of Monticello forgot to do was to free the man's family. So the day that his blacksmith became free, he watched his wife and 6 children auctioned off to 4 or 5 different purchasers and spread all over the state of Virginia. That's to remind us what we're talking about when we're talking about slavery. It is not an abstract institution. It's an institution that daily takes the most fundamental rights, the right to have and raise your family, the right to stay with your spouse, away from people at the whim of the master. But the Missouri Compromise isn't about that. It's not about ending slavery. It's only saying we're not going to spread it further into the West. And after 2 years of debate, we get another compromise. And the other compromise is, well, we'll let Missouri in as a slave state. We'll have one more slave state, but we won't let slavery spread north of Missouri into what is today Iowa and Minnesota, or west of Missouri into what is today Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. And so we now have another compromise. That compromise could not have passed had it not been for the representatives created by counting slaves under the 3/5 clause. Without the 3/5 clause, you could not have gotten it through Congress because the Southern congressmen didn't have the votes. But you get the compromise. The next compromise would be the annexation of Texas, the independent Republic of Texas, which had been part of Mexico, which 3 presidents in a row refused to consider annexing because they understood if you annexed Texas, you would be in a war with Mexico. And one of these, Andrew Jackson, was certainly not a man known to run from a fight, but he also didn't think you needed to start a fight over what was then perceived as this empty wasteland. They didn't know that it would produce great politicians like Ted Cruz down the road. And so this empty wasteland, which was only suitable for more slavery. And again, the debate over the annexation of Texas is complicated not merely by the fact that Texas is seen as a great empire for slavery, but also because people know that if you annex Texas, you're going to have a war. How does annexation get through? On a close vote in the House of Representatives, again with the 3/5 clause providing the margin by providing the extra votes in the House of Representatives. And guess what happens? A year later, we are at war with Mexico. And the war with Mexico reopens all of the debates over slavery and all of the debates over the compromises that we have been going through. Because if there had been no war with Mexico, the United States would have been stopped at essentially the Rocky Mountains. California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, that would all be part of Mexico. The United States would include parts of Colorado, parts of Wyoming, parts of Oklahoma, parts of Montana, and maybe the Pacific Northwest, Oregon and Washington and Idaho. And most of that would have become free states. And if most of those places had become free states, then perhaps sometime in the far distant future, the free states would have had the political clout to forge a new kind of compromise, which would have ended slavery. One could imagine a new kind of compromise based on compensated emancipation, where essentially the tax revenue of the whole nation buys the slaves of the South and they are gradually freed. One could imagine gradual emancipation, where the children of slaves are born free and slavery literally gradually dies out. One can imagine all sorts of scenarios, since places like Brazil would ultimately end slavery this way. But by opening up vast new territories to slavery, you simply create another debate. John C. Calhoun, who was the most aggressive pro-slavery politician of his age, opposed the Mexican War because he said if we fight this war with Mexico, we are going to end up blowing up over the territories. We're going to have to refight the slavery issue, and it's going to be a catastrophe. He was right. And so we win the Mexican War. We win the Mexican War very easily. We win it too quickly, too easily, at very little cost. Now, how can you say, Professor Finkelman, that a war is won at too little cost? How can you say it's won too quickly? Well, the reason is because most of the mid-level officers of the Mexican War, men like Robert E. Lee and George McClellan, learned how to fight wars in the Mexican War. And what was the lesson they brought back from the Mexican War? First, that wars are quick. Second, that wars are easily won. Third, that our guys don't lose many troops in the war. And fourth, and this is the lesson Robert E. Lee learned brilliantly in Mexico, if you charge headlong into superior forces, you win the battle. And he proved how successful that was at Gettysburg through General Pickett's charge. If you look at the disastrous tactics of Confederate armies, they are the successful tactics of the Mexican War. And if you look at the successful tactics of the United States Army in the Civil War, what you see is that they are not the tactics that a mere lieutenant Ulysses Grant learned in the Mexican War. He wasn't learning the same lessons Bobby Lee was learning, and it would cost the nation dearly because of these tactics. So the Mexican War taught a whole generation of people that wars are easily won. By the way, there were soldiers in the Mexican War who complained when they weren't wounded in battle, because they would think that when they came home, people wouldn't know that they were heroic and they had fought well. So some, we sometimes hear about soldiers who harmed themselves so they don't have to go into combat. In the Mexican War, we had the odd cases of people who shot themselves after the battle was over so they could prove they were really a hero. And by the way, one of the colonels in the Mexican War was a fellow named Jefferson Davis, who believed that with his military experience he could guide the Confederate armies in the Civil War. Not a good plan. So the Mexican War leads to a giant debate over the fate of the new territories and the fate of slavery. And the United States is essentially politically paralyzed from 1846, when the war begins, until 1850. Now, when I say politically paralyzed, it's interesting and it's instructive, given the nature of what we have just been through, the kind of Marx Brothers comedy, I suppose. Hey, I get to mention Marx again. The kind of Marx Brothers comedy that Speaker Boehner brought to America for 17 days. Because even though Congress could not pass any legislation to regulate the territories that had been acquired from Mexico, and even though Congress could not agree on what to do with the new Mexican territories, and even though there were vicious, nasty debates over the fate of slavery in the Mexican territories, on every other issue, Congress continued to keep, shocking as it would seem, Congress continued to keep the government open. And they continued to pass other laws, and revenue bills were passed, and the government worked. The only thing that wasn't working was nobody knew quite what to do with the territories. And this all comes to a head in January 1850, when the now junior senator from Kentucky, not Rand Paul, but a fellow named Henry Clay, comes into the Senate. Now, why is he the junior senator from Kentucky? Because he'd been in the Senate for most of his life. In fact, Henry Clay began his political career in 1812, and he had been elected Speaker of the House of Representatives in 1819, the youngest speaker ever. And he had been in the Senate, and he'd run for the president 3 times. But when he lost the presidential election in 1844, in a very close election, he quit politics. That is to say, he decided to spend the next 4 years making sure he got renominated in 1848. So he didn't serve in the Senate, and he politicked to get nominated as the Whig candidate in 40. And when he loses to Zachary Taylor, he simply goes back to Lexington, Kentucky to lick his wounds. And then in 1850, he returns to the Senate, and he's technically the junior senator because he's brand new elected. Of course, he is, in fact, the most senior man in the Senate. And Henry Clay introduces what becomes the Compromise of 1850. And Clay says, I have a compromise that will satisfy everybody. It will give something to the North and something to the South and solve all our problems. And this would be what the art of compromise is. And I think the essence of what I have been saying and what I'm going to say in a minute is that to have compromise, you actually have to give something to both sides. That is, when Carolyn came up to introduce me and she spoke about the idea that a compromise is when both sides are unhappy. To have compromise, you have to give to both sides. And so Clay proposes a compromise which in theory would give to both sides, but in fact he offers the North almost nothing. The essence of the compromise would be this, that California would come into the United States as a free state. That would give the free states 16 states and the southern states, the slave states, 15 states. Most history books say, oh, this is the great gift to the North. They're going to have a political advantage. But what those historians forget, and it's odd that they forget it because they're not stupid, and they can read the evidence, they can read the history. What they forget is that throughout the history of the United States, there had often been an imbalance of slaves. When the Mexican War begins, there are 2 more slave states than free states in the Union. That is, the South has a 4 Senate majority because Florida and Texas have been admitted to the Union, but there haven't been new states coming in on the other side. So Iowa has not yet been admitted to the Union. And so for a period of about 6 years, the South has a majority in the Senate. And throughout the history, you can find 2, 3, 4-year periods where one section has a majority and then the other section catches up. And while we look at history backwards and say, well, we see California came in and then we get a couple of more free states coming in, and by 1860, the North has a 3-state majority instead of just the 1-state majority. There's no reason to think that it wouldn't have played out the other way, that California would have come into the Union, and then another slave state would have come into the Union, perhaps New Mexico, perhaps Arizona, perhaps Utah, perhaps Nevada, because Clay's other compromise, which is the real gift to the South, is to say that all of the other Mexican territories, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, much of Colorado, much of Wyoming, some of Oklahoma, all of that would be open to slave settlement. And in the history of the United States, up to 1850, any place where slavery had been allowed to exist had entered the Union as a slave state. That is to say, if slavery was allowed in the territory, that territory became a slave state. And so if you looked at the Compromise of 1850 from the direction of the past, what you would say is that the North is getting California, and the South is getting this gigantic area of the West. And again, we assume it's Nevada and Utah and New Mexico and Arizona, but there's no reason why those 4 states couldn't have been 8 states. You could divide them up in a variety of different ways. Plus, Texas got a huge area to the west, which had never been considered part of Texas before. And again, you could have sliced that a different way, so you could have 2 states, the state of East Texas and the state of, I don't know, Midland? Odessa? El Paso? I'm not sure. So there's no reason to assume that it would have played out one way or the other. So the compromise, which as it's ultimately passed, brings California into the Union as a free state, but opens up all of the remaining Western territories to slavery. The other gift to the North was a law prohibiting the public sale of slaves in Washington, D.C. So you could no longer auction people publicly. And you should imagine what a slave auction is like, right? Where you bring a 19-year-old woman up to the podium, and every man is allowed to examine any part of her they want before they buy her. They want to know if she's a good piece of property. And so she can be publicly examined, and then you auction her off to the highest bidder. And then you might auction her husband off to a different highest bidder. Slave auctions were horror shows. And people objected to the idea of public auctions in the shadow of the Capitol building. In the shadow of the White House, you would be auctioning human beings. And so the Compromise of 1850 said no more slave auctions. But does that harm slavery? Of course not. Because it simply meant that if you wanted to buy slaves, you'd have to go across the river to Alexandria, Virginia, where there's a wide open slave market. You want to sell your slave, you just cross the bridge into Alexandria and you could sell your slave. So, in fact, ending the slave trade in D.C. does not affect slavery. And in fact, it might help slavery. And the reason it might help slavery is because as long as there were these obscene public auctions, people coming to Washington, D.C. could be angered over slavery. But if you were a northerner who had never encountered slavery and you go to Washington and there aren't any public auctions and all you see is the person serving you beer at the hotel is a slave, you say, well, gee, these slaves are no different than servants back up north. We don't see the horror of it. So in fact, from a shrewd perspective of a shrewd slave owner, ending the slave trade in the District of Columbia was a smart move because it deflected and got rid of anti-slavery thought among Northerners. And so the slave trade is ended. Now, what does the South get? Well, as I've said, the South gets this vast chunk of territory. The South gets a fugitive slave law, which creates the first federal law enforcement bureaucracy in the history of the United States. A federal official in every county of the United States empowered to call out the militia, to call out a posse, to do whatever it took to return a fugitive slave. I used to find it fascinating when, during the Civil Rights Movement, the people like George Wallace would complain about the vast federal bureaucracy because, of course, he didn't understand that the first vast federal bureaucracy was done at the demands of the senators from Alabama who wanted a federal bureaucracy to get their runaway slaves. And so for the first time in the history of the United States, well, let me put it another way. Before 1850, there was only one federal official that most Americans ever encountered. And who was that? The postmaster. That was the only person you ever met from the federal government, was the guy you got your mail from. And now suddenly there was a federal commissioner in every county in the United States empowered to enforce the fugitive slave law. In addition to that, Texas got $10 million. That's a lot of money in those days. I mean, today, $10 million, it's chump change, right? It's a quarterback. Not a very good quarterback, right? Hardly buy a decent pitcher for $10 million anymore. But $10 million was a vast amount of money. Now, why did Texas need $10 million? Because the Texas Republic had been bankrupt when it entered the United States. And Texas was deeply in debt. And I lived in Texas in the early 1980s when New York City was on the verge of bankruptcy. And there was what was called a federal bailout. And I listened to my students at the University of Texas, that little school down in Austin. I listened to my students in Austin whining about the fact that tax dollars were bailing out New York. And I thought it was really rather ironic because what is the first federal bailout in the history of the United States? It's the Compromise of 1850 to ship $10 million to Texas to bail it out of its debts because it refused to tax itself to clean up its debt from the era when it was a republic. Now, I, by the way, have no objection to that. I think the $10 million bailout was actually the easiest part of the Compromise of 1850. It was a no-brainer. Of course you pick up the debt of a new state coming in if it's coming in as a previous republic. We have always done that. But that's part of the Compromise of 1850. And so you get this compromise, which is in fact not a compromise, but it's an appeasement. It's a gift. The South gets everything except California. And by the way, and one other aspect of compromise is that when you have a compromise, you expect both sides to support it. There are 15 slave states in 1850, which means there are 30 Southern senators. 26 of them voted against California admission into the Union. So this is not a compromise. This is not both sides giving. Who are the four Southerners? Well, two are Whigs from Delaware. Delaware is barely a slave state, and it's barely in the South. The other two are the last great Jacksonian senators, Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri and Sam Houston of Texas. They vote for California admission. Nobody else does from the South. So it's not a compromise the way we see it. I want to end by talking briefly about the Fugitive Slave Law and how the Fugitive Slave Law, which is the central piece of this compromise, turns out to be a catastrophe for the people who sought compromise. What the Fugitive Slave Law does is to provide for a federal commissioner in every county of the United States. Provides that any person who claims a runaway slave can go to that commissioner with whatever documentation they have. And remember, this is before there are photographs, this is before there's DNA, it's before there are fingerprints. So you go to the federal commissioner and you say, "Hi, I'm Mr. Jones from Kentucky, and my slave John, he's about 25 years old, and he's about 5'9", and he weighs about 145 pounds. He ran away, and I saw him on the street the other day. Could I have a warrant to have him arrested? Now, there could be 10 people or 20 people or 50 people, depending on how big the city is, who resemble this description. And the slave owner could grab anyone he wants, bring that person before the federal commissioner, and the federal commissioner's only duty was to determine whether the person described by the slave owner met the physical description of the physical reality of the person brought before him. And the alleged fugitive slave was not allowed to testify in his own behalf. He could not get up and say, "You've got the wrong man." In a place like Massachusetts, where you have a fairly distinctive accent, which is different than, say, a fairly distinctive accent from Kentucky or Virginia. I was just at the sixth floor Depository Museum today, and of course, one only needs to listen to John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson talking during the campaign to understand these are really different accents. But a black man, a free black man born in Massachusetts who spoke with a Kennedy-like accent could not have gotten up in a courtroom and said, "Your Honor, you obviously got the wrong man. I speak like a Bostonian, not like a Kentuckian or a Virginian or a Texan," because he was precluded from testifying in his own behalf. And the president who signed the Fugitive Slave Law was a New Yorker, Millard Fillmore. He was a New Yorker who didn't care about slavery, thought slavery was annoying because it interfered with politics. He's the guy who will later run as the Know-Nothing candidate in 1856. And President Fillmore does everything possible to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law with as much vigor as he can. And he, at one point when some slaves resist being captured, he has 47 people indicted for treason against the United States because they would not help a U.S. Marshal capture a fugitive slave. They didn't do anything to protect the fugitive slave. They simply wouldn't pick up a gun and go after him. And so they were indicted for treason against the judgment of the U.S. District Attorney, who says this is not treason. And of course, the case isn't treason, and the U.S. Judge who hears the case throws the case out. But President Fillmore vigorously does this to enforce the law, to prove that the North will support the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, at the same time that this is going on, there is a movement coming out of New Orleans to invade and take over Cuba. Oddly enough, the people who were in this movement are known as filibusters. Not the same thing as a Senate filibuster, where you read, I guess, the Dallas phone book. I'm not sure what Ted read. But that's not what is meant by a filibuster in those days. Filibusters were people who would invade another country and try and take it over. Filibustering was illegal. There was a federal statute which made it a crime and punishable by long jail terms for organizing an army and invading another country. That seems to make sense. And a group of filibusters left New Orleans, went to Cuba, got intercepted by a naval ship along the way, were brought back to New Orleans, and Fillmore refused to prosecute them. A second group went to Cuba and were captured by the Cubans, and the United States government under Fillmore negotiated to bring these people back to the United States. But when they were brought back, they weren't put on trial because Fillmore did not want to offend his Southern supporters. By the way, why did these Southerners want Cuba? Because there were 300,000 slaves there. And they wanted more slaves and more slave territory. So it would be another slave state. You could grow sugar in Cuba. It would be another sugar plantation. And so this, again, is the notion of compromise. That if you're going to have compromise, it has to be compromise that works for both sides. It can't simply be one side. And what I would argue is that the United States, from 1787 until the eve of the Civil War, never has compromises over slavery. Because in every one of these debates, in every one of these fights, in every one of these political controversies, the slave states always win. Which is why, from 1788, when George Washington becomes president, until 1861, when James Buchanan leaves the White House, not a single person who is opposed to slavery ever serves as president. John Adams and John Quincy Adams didn't like slavery, but in fact, as Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams protected slavery in international negotiations, and as President, John Quincy Adams did nothing to stop slavery. They would be the closest you'd have to opponents of slavery. They didn't like it. The other Northerners who serve, Martin Van Buren, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan, are what are known as doughfaces. A doughface was a term of derision. A doughface was a Northern man with Southern principles. And it was said that they were doughfaces because their faces were made of bread dough, and Southerners could shape them into anything they wanted. And Fillmore, of course, was the classic doughface. I should add, as you mentioned, I wrote a biography of Millard Fillmore. And my son asked me when I was doing it, he says, why do you want to write a biography of Fillmore? And I said, well, it's easy to write a biography of somebody that you like, somebody who was good. It's a lot harder. The challenge is much greater when the guy is really awful. And so all of the rest of the presidents were slave owners. And if you think of the two-term presidents, people who got elected and reelected, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, what do they have in common? They're all plantation owners. They were all big-time slave owners. No non-slave owner gets two terms. The Northerners get elected, only get one term, and then they get voted out. If you look at the speakers of the House of Representatives from 1800 until the 1850s, almost all of them are Southern slave owners. If you look at the leaders of the Senate, if you look at the cabinet, if you look at the Supreme Court, there is a majority of slave owners everywhere you turn, even though by 1800, the majority of the population is in the North. And so from 1800 until 1860, a majority of the Supreme Court is made up of slave owners, with the exception of a brief 5-year period in the 1820s and 30s, even though the majority of the people in the United States are not slave owners. If you look at the presidential cabinets, you see one pro-slavery fanatic after another serving in presidential cabinets, most prominently John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis. But you never see anybody who is prominently anti-slavery serving in a presidential cabinet until Lincoln becomes president. And so what we have is a series of compromises from 1787 until 1860, which almost always favor the South, almost always favor slavery. And here's where the tragedy comes in. These constant victories by Southerners, easy victories, will threaten to leave the Union if you don't give us what we want. Thomas Lynch says that in 1776. Southerners say it during the Compromise of 1850 debates. If we can't have all of the other Western territories, we'll leave the Union. If we can't have this, we'll leave the Union. And the result of these threats was that Southerners came to believe that people who didn't own slaves really had no principles at all, wouldn't stand up for anything, and would never fight for anything. And so the result is, when South Carolina said, we've decided to tear up the Constitution and leave the United States, we've decided to create our own country, people who had taken an oath to preserve and protect the United States of America instead put on uniforms and shot at the United States. When I taught at the little college in Austin, I once gave a lecture where I referred to Robert E. Lee as a traitor. And then this kid came up to me. He was about 6'14" or 18, and he was just like huge. He had a shaved head, and he had muscles everywhere. And he said he was so angry he was quivering. And he said, "How could you call Robert E. Lee a traitor?" And I looked at him and I said, "You look like you might be in the military." And he said in 2 seconds, I couldn't say it this fast, he said, in 2 seconds he said, "Yes, sir, I'm in the Marine Platoon Leaders Corps, sir." But, sir. And I said, "Well, what's the oath you took when you entered the Corps?" And he gave me the oath that he took when he entered the Corps. And I said, "Well, that's substantially the same oath that Robert E. Lee took when he entered West Point." Now, if somebody in your unit put on a different uniform and started shooting at you, what would you call it? And he looked at me kind of like the mirror where you hit it with a pebble and the glass begins to crack. And he stood there for, it seemed like 2 minutes, but it was probably 10 seconds. And he finally said, well, couldn't you think of another word for it? To which I said, not really. And so the problem is, because of all these compromises, when Lincoln is elected, nobody in what becomes the would-be Confederate nation believes that Lincoln will defend the Constitution and defend the United States of America. And nobody believes that Northern men can carry a gun or shoot a gun or ride a horse. And every Southerner believes that he can take on 10 Yankees in a fight. Because, after all, we're tough down here in Texas. And we're tough down here in Tennessee. And that these people don't stand for anything, and therefore we can simply leave the United States, destroy the nation, take with us, by the way, all of the property built by the collective nation, right? So Fort Sumter, which was built by the taxpayers of the United States, we'll take that for ourselves. We'll take the forts, the post offices, all the gold in the post offices. We'll take it all because we're entitled to it. And they didn't believe there would be any response. And they were deeply shocked when they discovered there was a response. And they were even more shocked when they discovered that that response would last as long as it took to preserve the United States of America and recreate the nation. And that in the process, they would lose the one thing they had seceded for, which was to protect slavery. And again, people don't like to think about the fact that the Confederacy was created to preserve slavery. But you only need to look at the secession resolutions of South Carolina or Florida or Mississippi or Texas. The Texas Secession Convention says that Texas will never end slavery, that slavery will exist in Texas forever. The Mississippi Convention says that slavery is the most important material interest in the world, and we will never give it up. And South Carolina simply says a president has been elected who believes that slavery should be put on the road to ultimate extinction, and we cannot live in a government where that person is president. And so that's the problem with compromising on fundamental principles of human justice and liberty, that you may give the other side the belief that you'll never stand up for them. And of course that led to a tragic result and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and the destruction, aside from the billions of dollars worth of slaves, the destruction of vast quantities of property. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions or duck tomatoes, whichever you prefer.
I mean, it sounds like, from the way you tell the story, that it was all, so to speak, built in at the Constitutional Convention, that once those compromises were made, the other ones would have been hard to avoid, given how the system was set up. But I guess then, A, is that right? And then B, if that's right, to what extent was it a live option at the Constitutional Convention to set those up quickly?
Well, there are two answers. The first answer is, let's assume that it was set up. I don't believe that history is kind of an unfolding pageant. I'm not a Calvinist. I don't believe in predestination. I don't think that that once you do this, all of these things will fall into place. So let me turn to the second piece of it, which is the convention. One could imagine a variety of different outcomes. First of all, you could imagine that the 3/5 clause is the 50% clause. One could imagine that the Northerners say, look, this is a government of the people, and as soon as you let your slaves vote, we'll count them for purposes of representation. And that's our bottom line. And if South Carolina wants to go it alone, or if South Carolina and Georgia want to go it alone, all right, we'll take that risk. Georgia's the second state to ratify the Constitution. They would have been the first state, but the Constitution couldn't get there fast enough because, they didn't have FedEx in those days to deliver it. Georgia is surrounded by the Spanish and the Indians and all the British agents in Florida. They're scared to death. They are desperate for a strong national government to protect them from the people who surround them. North Carolina has a huge, huge Cherokee population. I don't think that those states would have opted out because I think they would have been scared. South Carolina is 60% slave. They need the National Army to protect them from their own property. So I think Northerners could have said, we're calling your bluff. We're not going to do this. On the slave trade debate, when the convention votes to allow the slave trade for 20 years, the vote is Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, and Connecticut. And then on a second vote, Massachusetts, and on a third vote, New Hampshire, join them. So you get 3 New England states joining with 4 slave states. I think if the 3 New England states had said, look, we're not going to go along with this, I doubt that South Carolina would have refused to ratify the Constitution. By the way, the convention was not debating whether you abolish the slave trade. The convention was only debating whether you protect it for 20 years. Then they vote on the Commerce Clause. And on the Commerce Clause vote, South Carolina votes with the North to have a simple majority to regulate commerce. But if South Carolina voted the other way, it still would have passed the convention. Because there are only 11 states in the convention and 6 northern states vote for it. And so if 5 southern states voted against it, it still would have passed. So you could have imagined things. The Fugitive Slave Clause is even more interesting because after the slave trade vote, 2 days later, the South Carolina delegates proposed the Fugitive Slave Clause. There's no trade-off. The North doesn't say, well, we'll give you the Fugitive Slave Clause if you'll give us X. The North simply says, fine, we want to go home. Now, what you see at the convention is a dedicated pro-slavery corps from all of the delegates of what becomes the slave South. They differ on only one issue. The Virginians are opposed to continuing the African slave trade. So they vote with the North on ending the African slave. I'm not protecting the African slave trade. And Delaware does the same thing. And one of the reasons why Virginia does that is because it has a surplus of slaves. And people at the convention make this point. They say, if Congress bans the slave trade, that simply makes your slaves more valuable. So it's unfair to South Carolina. So you could have imagined that there would have been other potential possibilities. The other thing is, what if the slave states say, fine, we'll have one country, we'll call one country the United States, we'll call the other country, how about the Confederate States? And so we'll have the Confederate States here, we'll have the United States here, and we'll see how it plays out. And of course, one thing then there would have been no Fugitive Slave Clause. And so within a very short time, vast numbers of slaves in Maryland and Virginia would have run into Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And after a relatively short period of time, one could imagine that slavery would have been severely weakened in Maryland and Virginia because you couldn't hold your slaves, at least say along the northern strip. 50 miles into Virginia would have to be a clear slave zone because any slaves in there can too easily run away. Baltimore would cease to function as a port because too many slaves could escape to the north. And one could imagine that within, say, 15 or 20 years, Maryland would secede from the Confederacy and join the United States because why be in this place that's essentially a slaveholder's country when you can't keep your slaves? That's at least a plausible scenario. The South becomes a great commodity-producing region. The South is essentially the model of a third world economy until the 20th century. All it does is produce commodities that other people process, right? The South produces cotton that England and then New England and New York process. The South produces tobacco, and the tobacco is shipped up to New York where it's rolled into cigars. It's only in the 20th, it's only after the Civil War that you get people rolling cigarettes in Richmond and in Durham. Before that, the tobacco is getting sent to Europe or it's getting sent to the North. So the South is a great commodity producing region. And what we know about modern economies, at least, is commodity producing regions do not do well in the long run. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is very rich, right? They produce lots of oil. What will happen to the Saudi Arabian economy when either they run out of oil, we find enough oil so we don't need it, or perish the thought, we discover some other way to move our cars from place to place? Saudi Arabia will become a former commodity producing country that doesn't have anything to produce. The other thing about slavery is that slavery is deeply destructive to intellectual thought and cultural, economic, and social development. They don't work very well together because slavery in the South leads to what is fundamentally a closed society. You can't debate the great issues of the time if the giant elephant in the room is not debatable. You can't talk about science if the only science you're allowed to do is the science that proves that black people were made by God to be slaves. There's a doctor in New Orleans named Cartwright who writes a big article in the Louisiana Medical Journal, which is then published as a separate pamphlet called The Diseases of the Negro. And it's really the diseases of slaves. And he discovers a disease which only slaves catch called drapetomania. It's known as the running away disease. And the funny thing, only black people seem to get this, and they up and run away. And this passes as medical science in the South. So part of the problem with the slave culture is that a slave culture pushes out intellectual development. There's a reason why there are no great universities in the South until the 20th century. And that includes UVA, which is not a great university in the 19th century. It includes, University of North Carolina, which is an okay state school. South Carolina has one of the great political theorists of the 19th century teaching at what's known as South Carolina College, now the University of South Carolina, a German immigrant named Francis Lieber, who has a German PhD, is a brilliant man, writes wonderful stuff, writes the leading political science text, government text of the 1840s. But in that government text, he doesn't discuss slavery. And he is eventually chased out of South Carolina, not because he said anything anti-slavery, but because he is not sufficiently pro-slavery. And he ends up becoming a professor at Columbia University. And Francis Lieber writes what becomes the Code of War for the United States, General Orders 101, which is the code of law for the U.S. Army during the Civil War, and one of the bases for the code of all international law on war. If we look at the international rules of war today, what soldiers may and may not do, half of it traces back to Lieber. But Lieber couldn't function in the South because intellectual work doesn't work. So one answer would be, you either don't compromise so much, you call their bluff. President Obama did this, and this is not a campaign speech for Obama, but President Obama essentially called John Boehner's bluff and said, do you really want to see the country collapse? Do you really want to see us default? Are you ready for that? And of course, Boehner, in the end, said, I guess not. I guess I don't want to destroy the United States economy. I got too many Wall Street voters sending me money. No Northerner, the Northerners at the convention were insufficiently willing to fight against slavery to call anybody's bluff. Another question? I'll try to give a short answer instead of such a long one.
So, I'm going to say the most controversial thing we've said here today. Wouldn't the real problem with what you're describing be that the initial compromise never happened? That the powers to be that had states got the concept of states' right to exist when they wanted to create a nation, but instead it created a union of nations and never created rights for the people, but instead created rights for a ruling class?
I would, well, aside from the last thing about the ruling class, because I'm not sure what the ruling class is, I would say that you are incredibly on the mark in saying that the idea of a union of states is kind of a crazy idea, especially when you have states that are so utterly unequal. That is to say, one of the concepts of union, one of the concepts of coming together, is that both parties have to bring something similar or equal to the table, right? So if I bring my expertise on making rubber and you bring your expertise on making tires, we could become Firestone. But if I have all the rubber and the air pumping ability and you don't have anything, then I don't want to have a union with you because you're not bringing anything to the table. And so when you have a union in which Rhode Island, which has almost nobody living in it in those days, says we have the same right, we should have the same number of votes in the Senate as Virginia, which is 20 times larger than we are, you have to wonder what are they thinking? And of course, they were limited by their own experiences. They were unable to think outside their box. I mean, one answer would be to have states, but to have representation based on some other way you govern. So that, for example, you have what in many countries are proportional representation, where you have 2 or 3 parties, they run a slate. If one party gets 42% of the vote, then they get 42% of the legislature. And if another party gets 35% of the vote, they get 35% of the legislature. Now, the danger with that, of course, is you can end up being Italy, where nobody has enough votes to run the country from year to year. But I don't think that would necessarily take place. But I think you're right in saying that one of the problems with the original Constitution is that it doesn't deal with individual rights or with a political system that would work on a national level, but rather you have this coming together of states that doesn't make any sense. And by the way, we now have the same thing in state legislatures and in the House of Representatives, where we have legislative districts that do not represent anything except that a particular political majority happens to be in that legislative district. I think the best example is Austin, Texas now, which I think is divided into 3 congressional districts. And the idea that a city of over 1 million people wouldn't have its own member of Congress is insane. But we've now gerrymandered to the point where congressional districts have almost no meaning in some parts of the country. And by the way, this is not partisan, because if you go to parts of Illinois, you get the same thing where you've got a Democratic district that is that doesn't seem to be realistic, but of course is producing a Democratic member of Congress. Some states are moving to computerized legislative districts, and they simply say, we got to make, if you need 1 million people in the district to get a member of Congress, or 500,000 people to get a member of Congress, we're going to create the most compact 500,000 districts we can wherever they are, and then you get away from this. So there are a lot of ways of thinking about how you do it.